What we face is demand being contained and even increased because of the fantastic actions taken by finance authorities, by central banks to help people and to help businesses. So demand stays high, and even in some places, even if we look at data, a bit higher than it was before the pandemic. Okay. But supply cannot catch up because of all these interruptions, and also because nobody expected that the recovery would be so fast.
Welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Ignatius, a columnist for the Post. This morning, my guest is Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the International Monetary Fund and the person who oversees our global economy. Madam Director, welcome back to Washington Post Live. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Wonderful to be with you.
So I want to start with the issue that I think the whole world is focused on this week, and that is the danger of Russian invasion of Ukraine and a war in Eastern Europe that would be unlike anything that we've seen in many decades. I want to ask you first about the strictly economic consequences of a conflict there. Have your economists and have you personally begun to make some rough projections about what conflict in Ukraine might mean for global growth, for energy prices, for inflation, for all the issues that the IMF worries about?
At the time of higher uncertainty for growth in the world economy, geopolitical tensions only make the situation more complex. And we already see that in terms of impact on energy prices. We very much hope that there would be a diplomatic solution because of the people of Ukraine and also because of the necessity to sustain the recovery of the world economy. The two channels of impact are going to be energy prices, already elevated globally, but especially in Europe, and also Ukraine being a breadbasket. Interruption of grain supplies from Ukraine can add to pressures on food prices that have also already gone up. It is so very important to find a pathway to reduce these tensions for the sake of Ukraine, for the sake of the European and world economy.
And let me ask one more practical economic question. The U.S. and its NATO allies have warned Russia that if there is an invasion of Ukraine, the response would be massive economic sanctions at a level the U.S. has argued has not been seen before. Tell us about what consequences you think that might have. Obviously, there'd be consequences for Russia, but what knock-on effects would be likely in the rest of the global economy from a sanctions regime as strict as what people are talking about?
As it has been described, it would inevitably create some interruptions in terms of how financial transactions are being done. The most severe of the proposed sanctions is concerning SWIFT, and that is an element of the functioning of the financial system that inevitably would have a spillover impact should it be triggered. But again, what we hope for is for pragmatism to prevail. It is not in anybody's interest to continue to exacerbate tensions at a time when the world economy is struggling to retain momentum and is faced with multiple challenges, and I'm sure we will talk about them.
We will. Just a final practical economic question before we leave the ominous issue of Ukraine. In the event of an invasion, a conflict, sanctions, and the disruptions that would flow from that you just described, would the IMF stand prepared to provide liquidity and other resources that might be needed on an emergency basis by the world due to the disruptions that would be caused by conflict?
Well, let's start from Ukraine. We have a ongoing program with Ukraine, and we have about $2.2 billion available to disburse to Ukraine between now and June under this program. Ukraine has been acting responsibly to build up reserves. It has also benefited from the special drawing rights allocation we have done last year. And in that sense, we see our avenue to support specifically the Ukrainian economy quite clear over the next months. If we are in a situation in which there are spillover impacts that require more engagement from the IMF for other countries, of course, we would be there. We have still about $700 billion lending capacity. But the most important role we play, and we will continue to play, is in assessing what are the impacts of action or inaction, and then making prudent policy recommendations how best to handle the situation as it evolves. So you can be sure that we are keeping a watching eye and, of course, thinking about the possible consequences, what can be done collectively, not just by the IMF, but the international community working together to secure the recovery from the COVID crisis and also to support what is in front of us, a very important transition to a green and digital economy. So we see the case we are describing in Ukraine within a global context that requires such a strong focus on priorities. And again, I repeat my message, a sensible diplomatic solution is the best way forward.
Final personal question. One aspect of your remarkable biography is that you grew up in Bulgaria in the years before the end of the Cold War, when it was part of the Soviet sphere of influence. I think we've all worried about a return to the kind of rhetoric and conflict and divisions in Europe that were part of your childhood. Just ask you if you'd reflect on the dangers of returning to that kind of Europe of divisions and conflict.
It is heartbreaking to see that there is a risk of, again, confrontation, and the consequences of this confrontation is ordinary people suffer. My brother is right now in Ukraine, in Kharkov, visiting his mother-in-law, and he tells me that the pictures from the 80s and 90s we lived through are back. Stores emptied, people anxious, not knowing what tomorrow will bring. So when we talk about geopolitical tensions, we need to remember it is ordinary people who bear the brunt of their impact. And if we can prevent a repeat of what we know was painful for so many hundreds of millions of people, that would be a very noble objective, and I hope we will pursue it.
Thank you for bringing that personal perspective to this crisis. Let me turn now to your basic work as a managing director of the IMF, and that's overseeing global economic trends. The IMF just issued in late January a pretty bleak assessment of trends. The headline was Rising Caseloads, meaning COVID caseloads, disrupted economy, and higher inflation. You said in releasing the report, I would have liked very much to have had a more optimistic outlook at the beginning of the year, but the reality is we're looking at a somewhat weaker momentum of the recovery and higher uncertainties, more risks in 2022. So I want to unpack that outlook document that you released, starting with COVID, the rising caseloads. The continued burden of the pandemic 2 years on, obviously is a fact of life we all live with. Everybody's struggling to think when we'll begin to crest and return to, more to normal. What are your economists, analysts, the people who help you think about the world economy think about the course for COVID around the world?
Well, let me start from the good news, and it is the recovery continues. Yes, at a slower pace, but we need to remember that in the beginning of this crisis, we feared a Great Depression. We feared 10% contraction of the world economy in 2020. That didn't happen because of the coordinated, strong fiscal and monetary policy response. In other words, helping households and helping businesses through a period of standstill in the world economy. But the momentum is slowing for two reasons. One is a slowdown in the two big engines of the world economy, US and China. And the second one, as you rightly pointed out, is COVID. It is still with us. It causes restrictions, and these restrictions translate into interruptions of global supply chains. That on its own is a problem because it adds pressure on prices to go up. And in that environment, the way I would describe 22 is navigating an obstacle course, with the three big obstacles being still COVID. You rightly put your finger on it, but then inflation and the measures we need to take to combat inflation, and then high levels of debt. So going to COVID, we must admit that despite all the progress that has been made in vaccinations, testing and tracing, treatments, we are not yet delivering sufficient support to the countries that are falling behind. 86 countries in 2021 did not reach the target of at least 40% vaccination of their people. In low-income countries, vaccinations are at 5%. In rich countries, at 70%. Why is this a problem? Because what we do is we retain a breeding ground for more and more and more COVID variants, and also because we are interrupting the normal functioning of our economy. One of the big problems we have created over the last 2 years is this dangerous divergence between the countries that are already reaching their pre-pandemic levels, rich countries, some of the emerging market economies, and everybody else. And what I want to put on the radar screen of our listeners is that for 2 decades, the world was doing the right thing. There was convergence. poorer countries catching up. That is good for their people. It is also good for peace and security in the world. For the first time in decades, the opposite is happening. Poorer countries are getting poorer, and they're getting less stable, more vulnerable. So my main message today is that everywhere we have to build up defense against COVID. Pandemic policy is economic policy. The biggest risk for the performance of the world economy remains this year COVID and the disruption it causes. So
And
continue relentlessly, as much as we are now tired of it, continue relentlessly to build this defense.
I think, Madam Director, you just answered the question I was going to put to you. There is a growing debate in the United States, and I think in Europe and other countries too, about whether, as we see the peak of the Omicron variant, it's time to think about returning to something closer to normal. Is it time for children in schools to ease mask restrictions? It's one basic part of this debate, and I'm curious about your view. I think I hear you saying no. We need to keep vigilant for a while longer, rather than begin to talk about a return to normal.
Actually, these two things are related. The higher our defenses are, the more we can return to normal. And in that sense, what we see is that when vaccinations rates are very high, when the testing and tracing is effective, when there is sufficient capacity to treat patients, we have normalization of economic activities. And this is what we have to pursue. We have learned to live and function with the COVID still around us. But we have to retain our capacity to protect health systems from being overburdened, because this is what creates panic. If I get sick, would I be treated? And to do so, we have all the responsibility to take actions in that regard. Protect yourself, protect your families, protect the functioning of the economy, so we can be in a much more normal environment to live and work.
Let me ask you about the second part of your January forecast, which is the disrupted recovery. What struck me, Madam Director, wasn't simply lowering the forecast for this year. It was lower by 1.2 percentage points for the U.S. than had been forecast, lower by 0.8 of a point for China. It's that your forecast going into 2023 next year continues to be bleak, and in fact is even lower. You're forecasting a decline from 5.9% in 2021 to 4.4% in 2022, and then down to 3.8% in 2023. In that situation of continuing slowing growth, should we be thinking more about economic stimulus? That's gotten a little bit of a bad name because of inflation fears, but do you think we need to be thinking more about stimulus to prevent that sharp downward slope in the growth curve?
We have to recognize that some of this slowdown is natural, because we get a bump when we are overcoming the contraction of the economy. In other words, as countries return to their pre-pandemic levels, it is natural that the growth rate will, if you wish, normalize. But it is also true that before we stepped into this pandemic in 2019, we were concerned about slow growth, low productivity, and also we were concerned about new risks to macroeconomic and financial stability, such as climate shocks. None of this has gone away. And when we look into the future, what we need to concentrate our attention on is how to boost productivity, and on that basis, rely on a higher growth. We know some of the elements of productivity boost: invest in people, skilled, educated, and also agile, able to move from a job to a job so they can contribute to the economy. Invest in research and development, invest in new technologies, because they provide a potential for higher growth. And also invest in infrastructure, both the normal physical infrastructure, but also the digital infrastructure, so we can see goods and services being better integrated. I am very keen that we don't lose sight that prior to the pandemic, things were not so great. And if you remember, 2019 was also the year of protests in Chile, in Paris, in Lebanon. And what we are seeing today is reemergence of this protest. What is the fundamental problem that pushes people to protest? Well, fairness, or the lack of it. And if we think about a major factor for economies to be more dynamic, it is for these economies to be more inclusive, that everybody can participate, that women are not left out because they lack childcare or affordable childcare, they can't get into the labor market. And that issue of inclusiveness of the economy is one that actually is on a weaker footing today, because the pandemic, unfortunately, has contributed to increase in inequality within countries, across countries. And that is where that key investment in people from the moment they are able to get into a preschool throughout their life, I believe is very important. And removing the barriers for participating in the economy, so we can rely on everybody's contribution and do better for all of us.
Let me ask you about one more obstacle in the obstacle course, as you described it earlier, and that's inflation.
Mm-hmm.
You talk in your assessment about the likelihood that assuming inflation expectations stay well anchored, is the phrase that you use. Inflation should gradually wane this year. And I was left uncertain as to where you are in what's really been an interesting debate among economists about inflation. There's the Larry Summers view for shorthand that says we've got a real problem here, and that inflation expectations in fact are growing in the global economy. And then our Fed chairman, Jay Powell, has said, no, it's largely transitory. He's modified that a bit. But tell us where you are in your judgment about how fundamental the inflationary pressure is today in the global economy.
Inflation is a more significant economic and social problem than we thought it would be some months ago. What is that we learned new that helps us to reassess the role of inflation, and then on that basis, the necessity to take measures, central banks to step forward, take measures to combat inflation? First, what we learned is that the interruptions in global supply chains are longer lasting than we initially thought. We were hopeful that they would be brought under control as early as in the first half of this year, of 2022. Now we see that they are likely to continue, both because the waves of COVID are still causing the necessity of some restrictions, but also because other factors contribute to pressures on supplies. Let's take one. We moved quite significantly away from services to goods. What does it mean? Much more demand for computers, for cars, for equipments that are necessary to produce all these goods. And the result is supply just cannot easily catch up. We also were underestimating the climate factor and the pressure it puts on food prices. We have to recognize we are in a more shock-prone world, and we do need to expect these kinds of shocks to be a factor in the future. And last but not least, we underestimated somewhat how much delayed consumption, in other words, people getting support through various forms of stimulus and putting it into savings, can contribute to a much stronger consumer demand. So we are in a situation in which, indeed, we recognize that it is important not only to rely on inflation expectations being well anchored, but to seek some interventions that would bring inflation under control. Central banks are doing it. They're doing it very carefully, in a deliberate manner, communicating their intentions, and the Fed has done a very good job in that regard here in the United States. In many emerging market economies, steps have been taken even earlier because inflation became a problem of a larger magnitude earlier. We need to recognize, though, two issues. One, in 22, conditions in different countries are very different. We are talking about fighting inflation in the United States, and in Japan, they're fighting to boost inflation because they cannot reach their 2% target. So there is an accordion of the presence of this problem and therefore measures to be applied. And the second point that we need to be very mindful of is that taking action to combat inflation has to be very well calibrated against the objective of supporting the recovery. So that balancing act is one that, again, needs to be calibrated in every country. And we need to be very agile, data-driven. What is it that we learn? Because when we think about inflation and increase of interest rate, withdrawal of quantitative easing, raising interest rates, that has spillover impact on access to credit and growth opportunities, the theme we were discussing before. It also has spillover impact on other countries. And there we have to be mindful of the other obstacle on our course, and it is higher level of debt. In 2020, because we needed to support an economy in standstill, both governments and private sector households borrowed more than they usually would. Debt levels in 2020 reached $226 trillion, the largest increase in debt since the Second World War. Now, we look at that picture. Obviously, a good performance of the economy would allow debt levels to gradually go down on average. But for countries under a high level of debt that happen to be slow on the COVID recovery because of low vaccinations, because of limited space, that change in policy, that increase in rates by the Fed, by other central banks, by their own central banks, that can be quite restrictive for their own recovery. And I want to finish with this picture. In 2015, 30% of low-income countries were in debt distress or close to it. In 2021, they reached 60%. And obviously, we have to be very mindful of measures that can be taken to prevent in different places debt problems turning into a domestic economic catastrophe. And the fund plays a very important role in that regard.
So that's a somber note to conclude on, the possibility that debt could produce, in your words, a catastrophe if it's not managed. Let me ask you a final question, Madam Director. Fed Chairman Powell and the Federal Reserve has signaled that it could begin raising interest rates for the first time in 3 years in March. We've talked about the inflation issues, but also the need to sustain growth, encourage greater growth. Do you think the Fed's this apparent decision to begin raising interest rates is a wise one?
Given the problem of inflation that, as I said, is an economic concern, it is also a social concern. The Fed is right to be driven by data and take appropriate steps. And let's remember, even with taking these steps, financial conditions remain very accommodative. In other words, we are far from interest rates, real interest rates, that can really bite. And I am confident that the Fed will sustain that well-calibrated, well-communicated policy actions so the recovery can continue, and at the same time, we can put the brakes on inflation. But again, inflation is a complex phenomenon. It is also a result of COVID. So back to my message, we need to think of pandemic actions as economic policy tools, because if we reduce the risks of more variants and more lockdowns, we are helping supplies to come on time, and we are helping the economy to recover faster.
So, Kristalina Georgieva, again, thank you for joining us and offering a lucid tour of the world economy, some complicated subjects you made, I think, clear for our viewers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll be back with future programming. I encourage everyone to check it out and see the interviews we've got coming up. Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register for future programs and find out what we've got ahead. Thank you for joining us today.